So how do we get our hands around the competitive life cycle? Well, let me propose the following tool for our toolkit here. This is simply another way of representing the S-curve that we have talked about previously here. So you see here a circle. Beginning at the very top, we have the emergence of a new technology or business model. It goes through this emergent phase. We have this annealing process where we get some coalescing around what the product should look like in general. That leads to a growth phase. And then the growth phase basically transitions and ends as we have this shakeout competitively that leads us into a mature phase. And then the process begins again with a new disruption. So we can think about each of these phases and each of these transitions as well as the overall speed of the competitive life cycle over time. So to just give you an example of how you can use this as a visual tool, here we see Apple in 2011. First off, we have the iPad. The iPad is a recent introduction here. The iPad coming about in arguably the emergent phase right now. We're not quite coalesced around what the dominant design might be for tablet computing, though we're getting there fairly quickly here. Next we move on to the iPhone. iPhone obviously predates it by a few years. We think about the broader smartphone market here. We now have some coalescing around what that dominant design is as embedded in the iPhone and similar offerings from Android and the like. And we're clearly in a growth phase for that market there. Contrast that with the iPod, which I've talked about on a number of occasions. The iPod, we're already arguably through the shakeout period. A number of entrants that had entered that market have now exited. We're in a more mature phase of competition in that space. And then finally, you think about a product like the Macintosh, the personal computer, been around for many, many decades now, obviously a mature phase. And interestingly to note, are we going to reach a disruption in that market soon, if not already with the iPad and tablet computing that's going to disrupt the competitive ordering in that marketplace as well. So some questions you want to answer in the course of doing a competitive life cycle analysis are questions around both timing and severity. So the timing questions. How long is a mature phase likely to last? Is this an industry in which there are literally decades before a large disruption comes along? Talked about the automobile industry, 100 years of the internal combustion engine, now perhaps going through a disruption with electrical and other types of hybrid technologies. How about the emergent phase here? When a new technology comes along or a new business model comes along, how long before we start to coalesce about what the design would be? In some industries, this is maybe a matter of months or a year or so. In other industries, this could play out over a much longer period of time. Similarly, the growth phase. Is growth going to be quick? Is adoption going to be very, very quick here? It's interesting to note that when you look at consumer electronics, compare or let's go back to the radio, to television, to color TV, to the VCR, to the DVD player. Those timescales have actually been shrinking over time. So in some cases, that shakeout, that growth phase would take place over 7, 8 years, maybe even longer. Now those seem to be getting shorter. And that gets to our overall characterization of an industry. Is this a slowly evolving industry in which these dynamics play out, once again, over years, maybe decades? Or is this what some people refer to as a hyper-dynamic industry, where these cycles run very, very quickly and you have to constantly dealing with disruptions within your marketplace? The second thing to think about is the severity of each of these transitions. When a disruption occurs, is it most likely to be radical in the way we've talked about, in that it redefines the capabilities that you have? Or is it more to be incremental, building off your existing capabilities and technology? Is there going to likely be one dominant design that dominates the industry? Or is the industry likely to entertain multiple designs that might have slightly different characteristics, but the market will support both of them? Is this an industry, for example, where there's a standards battle, where there'll be one dominant standard that plays out? When we look at high definition video now, there was 2 competing standards. One, Blu-ray from Sony, and another, HD DVD by Toshiba and some others. At the end of the day, the Sony Blu-ray standard won out, suggesting that at least there was a dominant design, single dominant design that was going to win out. Finally, we want to ask, what's competition going to look like after the shakeout period? Is this a winner-take-all market, like the Sony case here with Blu-ray? Or is this a case where we can have multiple firms competing and still doing well within the industry? Or ultimately, is this a contested market, like our airline industry we talked before, where it's going to be very hard for players to do well? We talked before about network externalities, and I used the case of Facebook here, where the value of Facebook goes up as others adopt it. Those types of network externalities often lead to such winner-take-all markets here, where you'd have a single firm dominate the industry because they get those network externalities working in their favor. Finally, the last thing we want to think about with severity, overall, to what extent is there a first mover advantage? How important is it for you to be on the leading edge of the technology and businesses as you go through the competitive life cycle? Another way of asking this is this broad question of how important is innovation and adaptation to our markets, to our industry? And secondary, if it is important, first, do we have an innovative capability ourselves? And second, can we appropriate value from this innovation, either if we innovate or others innovate? So let me just take a few minutes to talk about each of these. It's beyond the scope of this lecture here to dive into how to create an innovative culture or innovative strategy for your firm. Let me just simply say that to have an innovative capability often centers around, first of all, your organizational design, in which you create incentives and mechanisms to encourage integration of knowledge within the organization. Second, you need to think about the ways in which the firm brings in knowledge external to the firm. There's always internal development, R&D, and the like that firms engage in to be innovative and generate those new technologies. But increasingly, we live in what we call an open innovation world, where firms are working with other partners. Maybe they're forming an alliance. Maybe they're investing in new ventures through a corporate venture capital program. Perhaps they're using mergers and acquisitions and licensing as a way to bring technology into the industry. So once again, we can talk more at a later date about ways in which you can create an innovative capacity. Second, and equally, if maybe not even more important, is not only the ability to create innovation, but the degree to which you can actually appropriate the value from that innovation. So if you look at a little pie chart here, imagine a new invention comes out, a new innovation comes to market, and it creates value. Well, arguably, it creates value for the inventor, but it also creates value for customers, hopefully. So when Apple comes out with the iPhone, that creates value to you and I when we adopt it in terms of our value. But there's others who benefit as well. There's, of course, suppliers who are supplying that industry who may benefit and capture some of that value. And then finally, of course, there's competitors. There's imitators who come in and copy what we do and therefore can gain some benefit here. So the question of appropriation is, to what degree do we get a larger slice of the pie versus a smaller slice? And history is littered with companies that were innovative, came out with pioneering new products, and at the end of the day, their slice of the pie was incredibly small. I've already mentioned Netscape in the browser market, and we can think of others as well. EMI and CAT scanners is kind of a classic example. EMI came out, pioneered CAT scanner technology, but it was General Electric who really captured a lot of the value from that innovation because they brought other types of capabilities into the marketplace at the end of the day. So what drives value appropriation? Well, two things you want to think about. First, the strength of intellectual property protection. Talked about this in a number of contexts before. This can be both the legal system, we have patents, copyrights, and the like on our invention or our innovation, but it also might deal with the nature of the technology and market as well. So let me talk about where IP protection can be strong. Once again, legal protections, patent, copyrights, and trademarks. Now, just having those in and of themselves does not necessarily mean that IP protection is strong. It also has to be what we call enforceable. Many startups have found themselves in the situation where they might have a patent for a technology, but they don't have the resources to actually defend that patent in a court of law. Therefore, even though they have that intellectual property, it's not really a strong protection at the end of the day. In other instances, there are just simply industries where you might be able to get a patent, but it's notoriously difficult to defend that patent in a court of law. Software comes to mind as one that is more difficult than it is in, let's say, the case of microprocessors or biotechnology and the like. Second thing to think about. Are there substantial first mover advantages? We've talked before about learning curves. Is there a way to create customer loyalty or branding? All of those can protect your IP to the extent that you get in early and then you get an advantage from that early entry, this first mover advantage again. I've mentioned network externalities already today, this notion of standardization. To the degree that there are these types of processes in place, being the innovator can obviously reap tremendous gains from being early to market. Interestingly, there are some situations where being fast to market, diffusing fast to market, can be a way in which you can, in essence, capture the value of your innovation. It may very well be that others can copy you very easily, but if you can enter the market quickly, capture value, and there's potentially a large lucrative market early on, even if others can eventually imitate you, you can still do very well, at least in the short run. And then finally, are there other ways to slow imitation? Maybe it's trade secrets. Maybe the technology is technologically or socially complex in a way that this imitation is going to be slow. And this is what we've talked about last time in terms of sustained competitive advantage again. But remember, this is only one piece of the puzzle. We have to think about intellectual property protection, but we also have to think about this idea of complementary assets. These are the other things necessary to bring an innovation to market. We can think about manufacturing, distribution, sales and marketing. All of these are all important to be able to capitalize on a new innovative product or service. So when are complementary assets critical? Well, of course, one of the questions is how important is the complementary asset to be able to add value to the customer? But second, how tightly held is that complementary asset? Let's say I come up with a brilliant new idea for some consumer electronics device. Do I have an ability to manufacture that? Could I potentially outsource that? If there are lots of potential manufacturers of this product, that gives me an advantage. In the same way we've talked about bargaining power of buyers and suppliers in the past. However, if there's one specialized manufacturer in the world that I need to use to be able to bring my innovation to market, well, that gives them substantial bargaining power in our relationship, and they might capture more of the value from our innovation than I do. There are some ways in which companies can leverage complementarities or complementary assets across multiple platforms. The most obvious is high technology. We often see hardware and software, and you need both to make a product viable and desirable. When you think about the Apple iPod, clearly one of the value propositions there was the development of Apple iTunes as well. And the existence and the complementarity between iPod and iTunes makes it a barrier to entry for others to try to enter into that market at this point. And so, once again, it's beyond the scope of this lecture, but we could speak in greater detail about platform technologies and leveraging these complementarities as a way to capture value from innovation. So let me end with some broader points here. Of course, industries evolve through life cycles. These are in some ways predictable, they're observable, and remarkably consistent across industries. Of course, they differ in degrees and determines how long they last and the like. But once again, the overall patterns are relatively persistent. Industries are periodically disrupted by new innovations and business models that alter the competitive order. This is an interesting fact that we see once again in industry after industry, and relates back to my first corollary of the fundamental principle here, that over time, economic profits tend to dissipate as competitive circumstances change. Third, competitive success often determine how you navigate these channels. It goes without saying, if you just think about static positioning here, you will not be doing a good job in a strategic analysis. You need to think about these competitive dynamics, how the industry is likely to evolve, and try to foresee where valuable positions are likely to be. Finally, to the extent that innovation is critical to your industry, understand that it requires both the capacity to innovate, but also the ability to appropriate value from those innovations as well. It's those joint together that's going to allow a firm to be successful in navigating these hyperdynamic markets. Let me end there for today, and thank you very much.